The kind that starts out simple and then bam, it's just a total mess. Deadlines whooshing by, budget exploding. It's like,
Oh, a runaway train.
exactly. You've just experienced scope creep. And today we're diving deep into this project killer with this article, How to Conduct a Post-Mortem Analysis on Scope Creep by 𝘬𝗏. We're going to figure out how to dissect those project disasters and, even better, how to avoid them in the future.
It's all about turning those painful experiences into, valuable lessons, right? Nobody wants a repeat performance of a project gone wrong.
Totally agree. Let's say, just for example, you're doing a kitchen renovation.
Yeah.
You start with this vision, right? Shiny new cabinets, new countertops, maybe a fresh coat of paint. Seems pretty straightforward.
Right. What could go wrong?
Well, then you think, a backsplash would be nice. And hey, why not upgrade the appliances while we're at it?
Uh-oh, I see where this is going.
Yeah, and suddenly you're drowning in change orders, the budget's out the window, and your simple little refresh has turned into a full-blown construction nightmare.
Classic scope creep. It's sneaky like that. Start small and then boom, the whole project's off the rails.
So how do we prevent this from happening? The article really stresses defining the scope super clearly right from the get-go. And they talk about using SMART goals. I mean, we've all heard of SMART goals, but this article really digs into how they make you get specific.
What I find interesting is that people often think they are being specific, but they're really not. Like saying, we need a better website. What does that even mean?
Yeah, it's pretty vague.
A SMART goal would be something like, we're going to boost website traffic by 15% over the next quarter by, let's say, optimizing the content for search engines. See, much more concrete.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's like the difference between I want to get in shape and I'm going to run a 5K in 3 months and train 3 times a week. One's just a wish, the other one's an actual plan.
Exactly. And once you have those SMART goals, you need a way to, break the project down into smaller, more manageable bits. That's where the work breakdown structure, WBS, comes in.
WBS, it's like this super-powered to-do list for your project, right?
Yeah, you could say that.
But how does a WBS actually, help fight scope creep?
It forces you to really think through all the tasks involved in hitting those goals. It's not just about listing them out. It's about putting them in order, like a hierarchy, showing how each little piece contributes to the big picture. This way, it's way harder for extra tasks to, sneak in unnoticed.
So going back to our kitchen reno, it's like having a blueprint. We know exactly what needs to happen, who's doing what and when. So if someone suddenly says, hey, let's add a skylight, we can see right away how that impacts everything else, the timeline, the budget, the whole scope.
Exactly. And that shared understanding, that's key. The article makes a big point about getting everybody on the same page from day one, agreeing on what needs to be delivered and by when. Think about it. You start construction on your kitchen and your contractor has a totally different idea of what new cabinets means.
Ooh, yeah, that's recipe for disaster. So communication is key, right? Making sure everyone's on the same wavelength from the start.
Absolutely. Think of a clearly defined scope, one that everyone agrees on, as a kind of contract. It sets those expectations and boundaries and makes it a lot harder for scope creep to, weasel its way in.
Okay, but let's face it, even with the best plans in the world, scope creep can still happen. So what then? How do you figure out where things went off track?
That's where the next key takeaway from the article comes in. Pinpointing the root causes of the scope creep. And it's not about pointing fingers or playing the blame game.
Right, no witch hunts.
Exactly. It's about understanding why the scope changed. Was it bad communication, unrealistic deadlines, or maybe there wasn't a clear decision-making process in place?
So it's like detective work almost, gathering the evidence and analyzing the clues to figure out how the scope creep snuck in. The article mentions using interviews or surveys to get different perspectives on what happened.
Exactly. And sometimes those conversations can uncover, deeper issues, systemic things that you wouldn't see at first glance. Like, what if several people on the team say they felt pressured to say yes to every request, even if it meant going beyond the original scope? That's a cultural problem that needs addressing.
Ah, so it's not just about fixing the immediate problem. It's about digging deeper, finding those underlying issues that could cause similar problems down the line. But how do we know if scope creep is really a big deal? Is a little bit of it always a bad thing?
Now, that's a really good question, and it leads us to the third key takeaway. It's a great question, and it leads us to the third key takeaway, evaluating the impact of scope creep. Because you're right, it's not just about did the scope change or not. It's about how did that change, affect the success of the whole project.
So it's not always a black and white, good or bad kind of thing. There might be times when a little scope creep, I don't know, is actually manageable or even helpful.
Absolutely. I mean, sometimes a small change can actually improve the project overall. But the important thing is to be intentional about it, to really think about how it'll affect the timeline, the budget, the overall quality of what you're delivering, because even those little changes can have ripple effects.
And sometimes those ripples can turn into tsunamis. The article actually brings up the Sydney Opera House as an example. Like, all these little design changes they made ended up causing a 10-year delay and like a 1,400% budget overrun. Can you believe that?
It's a good reminder that those seemingly small changes can snowball into something massive. And it really highlights why analyzing the impact of scope creep is so important. You have to do it. Otherwise, you're just dealing with the symptoms without really understanding the underlying cause.
Okay, so we've defined the scope, figured out the causes, and assessed the impact. But even with all that, scope creep can still feel like this looming threat. What can we actually do to prevent it from happening in the first place?
That leads us to the fourth key takeaway: documenting lessons learned. Basically, it's like creating this project playbook, one that keeps getting smarter with every project you do.
So it's not just about pointing fingers and saying, we messed up. It's about taking those mistakes, yeah, but also the successes and turning them into, like, valuable insights for future projects.
Exactly. You got it. And it's not just about those big failures either. Documenting what went right is just as important, maybe even more so. Think about it. What worked well? What strategies were effective? Capturing all of it, the good and the bad, that's how you build a knowledge base that helps you avoid repeating the same mistakes and, even better, replicate what worked really well.
I love that it's like giving your projects this collective memory, so you're not starting from scratch every time. But how do you actually go about doing that? Like, what does a lessons learned repository look like in practice?
It can be something as simple as a shared document or a spreadsheet. A place where team members can write down what they observed after each stage of the project. What were the challenges? What solutions did they find? What would they do differently next time?
So it's a combination of looking back and also looking forward, analyzing what happened and then using those insights to make better decisions in the future. The article mentions a pretty dramatic example of this with the FBI's virtual case file project. It was this huge project, and ultimately it failed, but they managed to glean some valuable lessons from it.
It's a perfect example of how even a major setback can be a springboard for positive change. This virtual case file project was supposed to, like, revolutionize the FBI's case management system, but it was just riddled with technical problems and, yep, you guessed it, rampant scope creep.
Wow, so they went through all that just to scrap the whole thing. Ouch.
It was a tough blow, for sure. But instead of just giving up, they took that experience and completely overhauled their approach to software development. They realized that their old way of doing things, the waterfall method with its rigid, sequential phases, it just wasn't flexible enough for such a complex project.
So they needed something more adaptable, something that could handle those inevitable changes and unexpected challenges that always pop up in large projects, right?
Right, and that's where Agile methodologies came into the picture. Agile is all about being flexible, collaborative, and developing things in iterations. You break the project down into smaller chunks, deliver value incrementally, and you adapt to change as you go.
So instead of trying to build the entire system at once, this massive structure, they switched to a more modular approach, building it in pieces, testing each piece, and refining it along the way.
Exactly. And that shift in thinking, from rigid planning to adapting as you go, it was a direct result of those hard-earned lessons from the virtual case file project.
It's amazing how a failure can lead to such a positive change in the way you do things. But let's bring it back to, the practical stuff. We talked about documenting those lessons learned, but how do we actually put them into practice? How do we build a framework that keeps scope creep from happening again?
That's where that fifth and final key takeaway comes in.
Yeah.
And this is where things get really interesting. This is where it gets interesting. It's all about taking action, putting all this knowledge to work. We need to build a solid defense against scope creep, keep it from hijacking our projects.
Okay, so where do we even start? How do we create that framework that keeps scope creep at bay?
Well, the article suggests implementing a project management methodology like Agile or Prince2. I know they sound kind of technical, but basically they're just structured ways of managing projects with, a big emphasis on controlling scope.
Right. It's not about becoming like a project management expert overnight or anything. It's more about, I don't know, changing the way we think about our projects, having a more systematic approach.
Yeah, exactly. Like agile. Agile's great for those projects where things change a lot, where you need to be flexible. It allows you to adapt along the way while still, keeping the scope under control.
So, like with our kitchen renovation example, if we were using Agile, we'd break the project into phases, maybe tackle the cabinets first, then the countertops, and so on. So if we decide to, I don't know, switch from granite to quartz countertops halfway through, it doesn't totally derail the whole project.
Exactly. And then you have Prince 2, which is, more process-driven, super structured. It's really good for those big, complex projects where, like, detailed planning and control are super important.
So it's like choosing the right tool for the job. You pick the methodology that fits the project and the level of control you need.
That's a great way to think about it. But no matter which methodology you go with, there's one thing the article really emphasizes: change control processes.
Change control. Sounds kind of bureaucratic, but I bet it's pretty crucial in keeping scope creep from, getting out of hand.
It's absolutely vital. It's like having a gatekeeper for your project scope.
Yeah.
Every change that someone wants to make, it goes through this process. It gets scrutinized before it can cause any, major problems.
So it's not about saying no to any change. It's about having a process, a way to evaluate those changes and understand their impact.
Right. You got to look at how the change will impact the timeline, the budget, the resources, the scope, everything. And it's got to be well documented. Everyone needs to be in the loop.
So it's like a mini project inside the main project.
Yeah.
It's about being intentional, right? Making sure any changes are implemented in a controlled way. So you avoid those impulsive decisions that can lead to, like, scope creep chaos.
Yeah, I like that. It's being proactive, not reactive. We've talked about defining those SMART goals, implementing change control, all that good stuff. But there's another layer to all of this that's, well, it's fascinating, really.
Woo, fascinating. I love when you say that. It usually means we're about to get into the really interesting stuff. What is it?
It's the human side of things. Because let's face it, at the end of the day, projects are all about people. And people, well, it can be a little unpredictable.
Yeah, you can have the best plans, the most amazing methodologies, but if the people on the team aren't on board, well, good luck with that project.
Exactly. So besides all the technical stuff we've been talking about, it's really important to create a culture of, open communication where everyone feels comfortable collaborating and where there's a foundation of trust.
So it's not just about having the right tools, it's also about having the right mindset.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Picture this. You've got a team where everyone feels comfortable speaking their mind, sharing concerns, brainstorming solutions. That kind of team is going to be much better equipped to handle scope creep, don't you think?
Because they're more likely to, like, see those red flags early on, catch those little things before they become huge problems.
Exactly. And it's not just about identifying problems either. It's also about fostering a sense of, like, ownership and accountability. If everybody feels invested in the project's success, well, they're going to work together to keep that scope in check.
So it's about creating an environment where everyone sees scope creep as the enemy. They're all committed to fighting it.
Yeah, that's it. And it all starts with good leadership, someone who can communicate the vision, manage expectations, and really empower their team. That's crucial in preventing scope creep.
So it's not just about barking orders. It's about being a coach, a mentor, someone who inspires the team to do their best work.
Absolutely. You need to create a space where people feel valued, respected, where they feel like they can really contribute.
This has been a really fascinating deep dive. I think we've all learned a lot about scope creep, It's not just about following a bunch of rules. It's about understanding those underlying dynamics, the technical stuff, the human element, all the things that can make or break a project.
Totally agree. And I think the biggest takeaway here is that we need to learn from our experiences, the good and the bad, and use that knowledge to, keep getting better at project management.
And that wraps up our deep dive for today. But before we go, we'd love for you to think about this. We've talked about how to manage scope creep, but why is it so common in the first place? Is it our ambition, our desire to push the limits, or maybe, a fear of missing out? What do you think? Let us know your thoughts, and until next time, keep diving deep and keep those projects on GURK.